That letter was not written in anger. It was written in the same careful hand she had used for 11 years to write his correspondence, manage his appointments, and compose the thank you notes he signed without reading. Abigail noticed that about herself afterward, that even at the end she had been precise. She had been 23 when she married Mr. Aldous Vane. That is not his real name, but the name by which she had known him before the wedding. Mr. Vane, the man her father had selected, the man who had come to their drawing room twice for tea, spoken pleasantly about the harvest, and left both times without once asking what she thought about anything. She had not expected him to ask. That was not what those visits were for. Her mother had pressed her hand the morning of the wedding and said, "He is a good man, Abigail. He will be steady." As if steadiness were what a 23-year-old woman needed most. As if steadiness were a substitute for being seen. He was steady. That much was true. Mr. Aldous Vane was steady in the way that old furniture is steady, reliable, solid, oriented always in the same direction, unmoved by anything that happened in the rooms around it. She moved into Ashburn, his estate in the northern county, in the 3rd week of September. The house was large. The staff was formal. Mrs. Hatch, the housekeeper, showed her through each room with the efficient brevity of a woman who had managed this house for 20 years and intended to manage it for 20 more. Abigail walked behind her and nodded and said nothing, because she was new and she understood that being new meant learning which questions were welcome and which were not. By November she had learned the rhythms of the house. By January she had begun, quietly, to improve them, not because anyone asked her to. Aldous had not said, "Abigail, would you take over the household accounts?" He had simply left them on the corner of his desk one morning, untouched for 3 weeks, and she had understood that this was an invitation of a particular kind, the kind that does not require words because it assumes the answer. She took over the accounts, then the correspondence, then the management of the tenant farmers on the eastern quarter of the property, because the steward, a Mr. Graves, had grown old and unreliable, and Aldous had not yet done anything about replacing him. She did not replace him. She worked around him carefully, so that he retained his dignity, and the estate retained its function. And when he retired 2 years later, the transition seamless, because she had already been doing the work. Aldous noticed none of this. Or if he noticed, he did not say so. She told herself, in the first year, that this was how it was. She told herself, in the second year, that things would change when he knew her better. In the 3rd year, she stopped telling herself stories about the future, and began simply managing the present, which was easier. She was not unhappy, exactly. That is the part that is difficult to explain. She was not a woman who wept in empty rooms or wrote letters to friends describing her misery. She was a woman who organized the winter stores and revised the estate's leasing agreements and made sure the household ran so smoothly that no one, not the staff, not the tenants, not the occasional guests who came to Ashburn for shooting weekends or political dinners, ever had reason to notice there had been a problem. That was, she understood much later, precisely the problem. When you are that good at managing something, the person you are managing it for never has to become aware that it needed managing. Aldous moved through Ashburn, like a man moving through a hotel, comfortable, well-served, unconcerned with the mechanisms that produced his comfort. The fires were lit. The meals were timed correctly. His correspondence was answered. His guests were received. His tenants were appeased. He had no reason to ask how. He had no reason to ask who. There was a man named Dr. Whitmore who attended the autumn dinner that Abigail organized in the 4th year of their marriage. He was a physician from the city, a friend of Aldous's from university, and he arrived late and sat at the far end of the table and talked, for most of the meal, with the woman to his left about a paper he had recently read on the subject of nervous disorders in women. Abigail was seated at Aldous's right, which was her place. She listened to Dr. Whitmore's conversation with quiet attention, and said nothing for a long while. Because the dinner was going well, and she was monitoring 7 things simultaneously, and keeping track of the conversation was simply one of them. Then Dr. Whitmore said something that was not quite accurate, a mischaracterization of the paper he claimed to have read. And she corrected him, not sharply. She was never sharp in company. She simply said, with the pleasantness of a woman who had been trained from girlhood to be pleasant, that she believed the study in question had drawn a rather different conclusion, and that the findings were more nuanced than the summary he had offered. Dr. Whitmore looked at her with genuine surprise. Then he asked her a question, a real one. Not the kind that men ask women at dinner to be polite, the kind that ends with a nod before the answer is finished. He asked her what she thought about the methodology. She answered him. At some point the table around them grew quiet, and she became aware that she was the only person speaking, and she finished her thought and waited. Aldous, beside her, said, "Yes, well, more wine, Whitmore?" The table moved on. Dr. Whitmore moved on. She moved on too, because that was what you did. But she remembered that moment. She remembered the way Aldous had redirected. Not rudely, not even unkindly, but with the automatic efficiency of a man returning a conversation to its proper channel. As if her speaking at length were a digression. As if the substance of what she had said required no acknowledgement before the subject was changed. She thought about that for a long time afterward. Not obsessively. Not with bitterness, at first. But with the quiet attention of a woman who has learned to notice things that no one else is watching. The 7th year was the year she began setting aside a small amount from the household accounts each quarter. Not stealing. She was meticulous about that distinction. The household accounts were substantial, and she managed them with exacting care, and there were always legitimate savings to be made. A better price negotiated with the grain merchant, a reduction in waste that had previously gone unnoticed, a renegotiated contract with the laundering service in the village. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The savings went to a separate account at a bank in the city that she had opened under her own name. Her given name, not her married one. Abigail Norcross. She had been Abigail Norcross for 23 years before she became Mrs. Vane, and she had never quite stopped being her, even if the world had stopped using that name. She did not know exactly what she was saving for. She told herself it was prudence. A woman of any sense, in any era, understood the value of having something that was purely hers. Her own mother had kept a small amount hidden in the lining of a winter coat. Not because she expected to need it, but because having it made her feel less like something that could be misplaced. Abigail saved. Quietly. Consistently. Over 4 years she saved enough to live simply in a small house for perhaps 2 years, then 3, then more. She did not make plans. She simply made it possible to have plans. It was a dinner party in the 11th year of their marriage that made her understand that she had, without fully acknowledging it to herself, already decided. Aldous had invited a group of men from the county association, landowners, mostly, with 2 solicitors and a retired magistrate, along with their wives. 14 people. Abigail had organized the evening down to the placement of the salt cellars, and she had done it well, as she always did. The dinner itself was unremarkable for the first hour. Aldous was charming. He was always charming in company. And the conversation moved through politics and the harvest, and a contested boundary line between 2 of the neighboring properties. She listened and occasionally spoke and kept the rhythm of the table, without calling attention to herself, which was the particular art she had perfected over 11 years. Then one of the wives, a Mrs. Pemberton, asked Aldous directly, "Your estate runs so beautifully, Mr. Vane. How do you manage it all?" It was a polite question. The kind people ask not because they want a real answer, but because the answer provides an opportunity to compliment someone. Aldous smiled. He leaned back slightly, the way he did when he was about to speak at length. "I have good instincts," he said. "And a strong staff." Mrs. Pemberton nodded warmly. "That makes all the difference." She looked briefly at Abigail, then back at Aldous. "And your wife is a lovely hostess." "She is," Aldous said, pleasantly, without looking at her. She was sitting 18 inches to his left. She picked up her water glass and set it down again. She did not look at her hands. She looked at the candelabra at the center of the table, the one she had polished herself last Tuesday because Mrs. Hatch's arthritis had been bad that week, and she counted the candles. 7, and she thought, 11 years. 11 years of accounts and correspondence and tenant negotiations and household management and social calendars and diplomatic correspondence and agricultural planning. 11 years of making it look as though it ran itself. 11 years of being the mechanism that no one ever mentioned when they complimented the clock. Good instincts, he had said, and a strong staff. She had been neither. She had been the whole of it, and she had been invisible. She did not cry. She did not excuse herself from the table. She refilled Mrs. Pemberton's wine glass at the right moment and asked the solicitor on her left about his daughter, whom she remembered had recently become engaged, and she was present and gracious and appropriate for the remaining hour of dinner and for the tea afterward, and she said good night to every guest with warmth and saw them to the door and thanked them for coming. Then she went upstairs. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, which had always been separate from his, as was customary, as was sensible, as was the arrangement from the very beginning, and she did not write anything. She simply sat, and the thing that had been building for 11 years, The things she had managed and organized and filed away and redirected like an item of correspondence that needed handling later. She let it rest in the room with her. She did not name it. She did not have to. She already knew what she was going to do. She spent the next 3 weeks being very quiet and very thorough. She completed the winter accounts and left them organized and annotated in a way that any competent person could follow without her. She drafted a management guide for the estate's 3 primary tenant arrangements and left it in the estate files. She wrote notes. Not explanations, not justifications, but functional notes. About the ongoing relationships with the grain merchant, the solicitors, the county association, the charitable committee she had chaired for 4 years without Aldous ever attending a meeting. She did not write these things to make leaving easier for him. She wrote them because she was not the kind of woman who left things broken. She arranged for her trunks to be sent ahead by carrier to a boarding house in the city, 2 weeks in advance, through a carrier she had never used before. She told the carrier they contained winter goods for a cousin who was moving house. She was specific enough to be believed and vague enough to be unremarkable. She withdrew from the bank account in the city. Not all of it. She was careful about that too, because sudden large withdrawals attract attention. She arranged it in stages, over 2 weeks, through correspondence, with the kind of quiet efficiency that had characterized everything she had done for 11 years. And she wrote one letter. Not to him at first. She wrote, first, to her sister in Edinburgh, her younger sister, Beatrix, who had married a man who asked her opinion on things, and still seemed surprised by how often she was right. Abigail wrote to Beatrix and said that she was coming to the city and that she would need a place to rest for a short time, and she asked nothing else. Beatrix wrote back in 4 days. Come whenever you like. Your room will be ready. That was all she needed. The letter to Aldous she wrote on a Thursday evening in November, with the fire going and the house quiet around her. She wrote it in 2 drafts. The first was longer. It explained, it justified, it asked him to understand. She read it once and set it aside. Then she wrote the second one, which was shorter, and which explained nothing, because she understood by then that explanation was not something she owed him. Aldous, she wrote. I have managed this house and this estate with care for 11 years. The accounts are in order. The tenant arrangements are documented. Mrs. Hatch knows the household. You will not struggle to continue without me. I will not struggle to continue without you. I am leaving because I am worth more than being a mechanism that no one names. Abigail Norcross. She signed her maiden name deliberately. Not as a cruelty, as a clarification. She left at 4 in the morning, while the house was still dark. She had arranged her own transportation, a hired coach from the village, ordered under a small pretext. She carried one bag herself, the kind of bag that does not suggest departure, that looks like a woman running an errand. Her trunk was already in the city. She walked through the front hall of Ashburn one last time, and she did not look at it with grief. She had thought she might. She had loved certain things about this house. The library, which she had organized and expanded. The kitchen garden, which she had replanted in the 5th year. The east window in the sitting room where the morning light came in, at an angle that made everything look considered. She did not grieve it. It had never been hers. The coach was waiting at the gate. She got in. The driver did not speak. The road was dark and the morning was cold, and she sat with her bag in her lap and watched the lights of Ashburn disappear behind the tree line. And she felt, not relief, exactly, not triumph. Something quieter than either of those things. She felt like a woman who had set down something very heavy, and was only now beginning to understand how long she had been carrying it. Aldous found the letter at 7:30, when he came down for breakfast, and she was not there, and Mrs. Hatch, when asked, said only that she had not seen Mrs. Vane since the previous evening. He read it standing in the hallway. He read it twice. His first thought, he would admit this later, to his cousin Stephen, in the uncomfortable way that men admit things they would prefer not to, was about the accounts. Who would handle the accounts? Then about the tenant correspondence that was due before Christmas. Then about the county association dinner he had agreed to host in February, which he had assumed Abigail would organize. It was the third thought, the one that came after the practical ones, that he did not say out loud. The third thought was, when did this happen? He stood in the hallway of his house for a long time. The fire in the study had been laid and lit, as it was every morning. The breakfast had been prepared and was warm on the sideboard. Mrs. Hatch moved through the corridor at the precise distance that household staff maintain when they are aware that something has gone wrong and do not wish to intrude. Everything was running. Everything was orderly. Everything that was running and orderly had been her. He had known, in some abstract way, that she managed things. He had known she handled correspondence. He had thought of it the way one thinks of the structure of a bridge: present, functional, not requiring examination. He had not thought about what it had cost her to be the structure. He had not thought about whether she was paid in any currency other than the maintenance of the house, and the social respectability of being Mrs. Vane. He had not, he understood in that hallway, thought about her much at all. Not because he disliked her. He did not dislike her. He thought she was capable and composed and, he used the word to himself without irony, convenient. She was convenient. He read the letter again. I am worth more than being a mechanism that no one names. He sat down on the bench in the hallway, the one she had reupholstered herself. He now remembered, 3 years ago, without mentioning it. And he sat there with the letter in his hand for a long time. His cousin Stephen arrived that afternoon, not summoned, but passing through on his way to the coast and calling in as he often did. He found Aldous still in the study, the letter on the desk in front of him, the winter accounts open beside it. Abigail has left, Aldous said. Stephen sat down. He read the letter when it was offered to him. He set it on the desk and said nothing for a moment. When did you last ask her what she thought about something? Stephen said finally. She was always involved in, not the estate, not the household. Stephen was patient but direct, the way he was when he had something uncomfortable to say. When did you last ask her what she thought, about anything at all? What she wanted to do with an afternoon, what she had read, whether she was content? Aldous did not answer. How long have you been married? 11 years. Stephen looked at him without surprise, which was worse than if he had looked at him with it. Has she ever seemed unhappy to you? Aldous thought about this. He thought about it carefully, which was the problem. The fact that it required careful thought at all. She was always very composed, he said. Yes, Stephen said. She was. He said it in a way that made clear he considered this an answer. Aldous wrote to her. Of course he wrote to her. He found the address through her sister Beatrix, who provided it without warmth or additional information, and he wrote twice, in the first month, letters that began with the practicalities and moved, with apparent difficulty, toward something more personal. She could tell, reading them, when he had crossed from the territory he was comfortable in, to the territory that required something more from him. The sentences shortened. The phrasing became less certain. She read both letters carefully. She thought about them. She was living in a set of rooms in the city by then, not Beatrix's house, where she had stayed for only 2 weeks before arranging something of her own. The rooms were small and not particularly fashionable, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she did not mind this. She had spent 11 years in a house that was large and well appointed and someone else's, and there was something in these small rooms that fit her in a way Ashburn never had. She had written to the editor of a small journal on household management and agricultural organization, a journal she had been reading for years and contributing small unsigned notes to when she had something to say, and she had written under her own name this time and proposed a series of articles. The editor had written back within a fortnight. She was discovering quite a lot to say. She replied to Aldous' second letter, not to his first. She let that one pass without answer, because she was still deciding how to answer, and she had learned over 11 years that some things are better for waiting. His second letter was different from his first. It was shorter. It said, I have been thinking about what you wrote. I believe I did not see you clearly. I do not know if that can be repaired, but I would like, if you are willing, to understand it better. She read that several times. She thought about the dinner party. She thought about Mrs. Pemberton asking how the estate managed so well, and Aldous leaning back with his easy confidence, and the candelabra with 7 candles. She thought about his letter. She thought about her rooms, and her articles, and Beatrix, who had written last week with an invitation to a lecture on botanical illustration that Abigail had gone to and found she loved. She thought about what it felt like to be asked a question and to finish the answer before something else was introduced. She thought about what a marriage could be and what this particular marriage had been, and whether those two things could be made to overlap, or whether the gap between them was simply too wide and too long established to cross. She did not write back immediately. She sat at her desk, in her rooms, in a city where she had begun to know people who knew her as Abigail Norcross, and she thought about it for a long time. Then she wrote, I am not the same woman who left Ashburn in November. I am not sure that woman would have been able to tell you this. I am telling you now. What I needed was not management of the household. What I needed was to be known. I do not know if you are capable of that. I am not certain you know either. But I am willing to find out whether you are, if you are willing to understand what finding out will require of you. She signed it Abigail Norcross. She did not say she was coming back. She did not say she was staying away. She said what was true, in the plainest language she could find, and she sent it, and she returned to her article on estate accounting, which was due to the editor by Friday and which she intended to finish. The reply came 12 days later. It was the longest letter Aldous had ever written to her. She could tell, reading it, that he had written and rewritten it. Not because the handwriting changed, but because the tone did, partway through, shifting from the register he was used to into something less polished and more true. Near the end he wrote, "I called the estate well run because that is how I thought of it, as a thing that ran. I did not think of you as the reason. I am not certain I thought of you as a person separate from the running of things. I understand now that this is a significant failure. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you to tell me what it would mean to do better, if you were willing to tell me." She read that paragraph 3 times. It was not enough, on its own. She knew that. A man understanding his failure in a letter is not the same as a man being different in practice. And she had spent 11 years learning the distance between what Aldous understood and what Aldous did. That distance was considerable. She had no guarantee that the letter changed it. But the letter was real. It was not formal. It was not convenient. It was, for the first time in 11 years, a question that was actually asking. She thought for 2 more days. Then she wrote back. She agreed to meet him, not at Ashford, but in the city, on ground that was neither his nor theirs but hers, for a single afternoon, so that she could look at him and hear him speak and determine for herself whether the man in the letter was also the man in the room. She was 34 years old. She had her rooms. She had her name. She had her articles and her account at the bank, and her invitation to the botanical lecture and her sister's Sunday dinners. She had at last a life in which she was visible. She was willing to see if there was room in it for a man who was finally, with considerable effort, and no small amount of discomfort, learning to look.